Hey guys, so I'm going to show you how to start the lip of the Mastiff. So I usually leave a relatively decent end to tie it off later. And we are going to start by chaining 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Skip the first stitch and SC6 into the second. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then I'm going to chain 2. That's round 1, and then we're going to turn, and we're going to HDC into that first chain. It's kind of difficult to get the turn, but it's worth it. So we're going to increase into this one. So that's 1 HDC, and then increase. Then we're going to HDC into the second chain that we chained at the end, which is right there. Sometimes it gets difficult. Go. And then we're going to HDC into the first of the 6 stitches. So that's the first of the 6 into that second chain we did in the previous round. Now we're going to increase into the next, so the second of the 6, single stitch into the third, increase into the 4th, increase into the 5th, single stitch into the 6th, got it right there, and then you'll see that we get to kind of this indent, and we have this hole which was where we did the 6th into, so we're going to HDC increase into that hole. So I'm just going to go into that hole, HDC increase, and we're left with 3 chains down here. So we're going to HDC 1 into the first chain. Oh, there we go. Can be a bit fiddly. HDC 1 into second chain, and then HDC increase into the last chain. 1, 2, and then turn for round 3. And then it should look like this. And for round 3, you're just going to go around again and then keep going back and forth.